I was 6 years old the first time I understood that my voice was not mine to use freely. We were sitting at the long wooden table for supper, my brothers and my father and my mother and all of us girls lined up on the bench like beads on a string. I had a question. I don't even remember what it was now. Something small, something a child asks without thinking. And I opened my mouth. My mother's hand came down on my wrist, not hard, just firm. And she looked at me with eyes that said everything her mouth didn't. Not now, not here, not you. I was 6, and I already knew, somewhere in my body before I could name it, that the rules for me were different than the rules for my brothers. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I left in my mid-20s. And this channel is where I finally say the things my community would never allow me to say out loud. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. And if you want to keep hearing the truth from behind the prayer cap, subscribe right now and tap the like button. Tell me in the comments, did you grow up somewhere that taught you to be small? I read every single one. Now let me tell you what they actually teach little Amish girls before they are old enough to understand what is being done to them. The first lesson is not spoken out loud. It never is. The first lesson is delivered through 1,000 small moments before a girl turns 5. It is delivered in the way her mother moves through a room, always working, never still, never complaining. It is delivered in the way her father sits at the head of the table while her mother stands at the stove. It is delivered in the way her older sisters clear the dishes before they have finished eating, because the men are done and the men come first. Nobody sits a little Amish girl down and explains this to her. They don't have to. Children absorb what they see. And what I saw every single day from the moment I was old enough to observe anything was a world with a very clear order. Men lead, women follow. Girls learn to follow before they are old enough to question whether the order is right. By the time I was 4, I was already helping my mother fold laundry. By 5, I was setting the table. By 6, I was washing dishes while my brothers went outside to play after supper. I did not think this was unfair. I had never been shown a world where it could be any other way. That is the first mechanism of control. Not force, not punishment, but the complete absence of any alternative. You cannot want what you have never seen. The second lesson comes around age 6 or 7, when girls begin to understand the ordnung more consciously. The ordnung, our unwritten code that governs everything, is never handed to you as a document. It lives in correction. Every time you step outside its lines, someone pulls you back. And for girls, the lines are drawn tighter than for boys from the very beginning. My brother Samuel, 2 years older than me, could run to the neighbor's farm without asking. He could raise his hand in church to ask the deacon a question. He could speak at the supper table without waiting for a pause. These were not things that were ever forbidden to him out loud. They were simply allowed in the way that air is allowed, unremarkable, assumed. For me and my sisters, none of those things were allowed in the same way. We asked permission before we left the yard. We did not speak in church. At the table we listened. If we wanted to say something, we learned to catch our mother's eye first and read whether the moment was acceptable. We learned, very young, to take up as little space as possible. And when we did step outside those invisible lines, when we spoke too loudly, when we pushed back, when we showed what the community called Eigensinn, which means self-will, our own thinking, the correction came swiftly, not always as punishment. Sometimes it was a look, sometimes it was a quiet word from our mother later. Sometimes it was the bishop's wife touching your arm after church and saying softly that a girl who thinks too much of herself has forgotten who she belongs to. That sentence. I heard a version of it more times than I can count growing up. A girl who thinks too much of herself has forgotten who she belongs to. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. Everything I'm telling you here, the ordnung, the correction, the silence, it's all part of something much larger, and the guide goes into all of it. The third lesson is the one that reaches deepest, because it is wrapped in something that feels like love. Around age 7 or 8, Amish girls begin receiving what I can only describe as theological instruction in smallness. It comes from the church, from the bishop's sermons, from the way scripture is selected and interpreted and handed to you. Gelassenheit. That is the word at the center of Amish life. It is a German word, and it is translated as yielding, submission, letting go of the self. In my community, Gelassenheit was considered the highest virtue. The goal of a good Amish life was to yield your own will to God's will and the community's interpretation of God's will completely. For men and boys, Gelassenheit looked like humility about work, about possessions, about pride. It was about not standing out, not buying a bigger farm than your neighbor to show off, not decorating your buggy, keeping yourself plain. For women and girls, Gelassenheit meant something different in practice. It meant your husband's judgment over your own. It meant the bishop's interpretation of Scripture over your own reading of it. It meant that a woman who deferred, who yielded, who asked before she acted, that woman was closer to God than a woman who trusted her own mind. I was 8 years old when a woman in our district left her husband. I will not tell you the details of why because they were serious, and she had real reasons. What I remember is the Sunday afterward, when the bishop spoke about it in church. He did not say her name, but everyone knew. And what he said was this: a woman who cannot yield her will is a woman who has placed herself above God. I was 8. I sat on that hard wooden bench and I heard that, and something in me understood, at a level below conscious thought, that the cost of self-will for a woman was not just social, it was spiritual, it was eternal. And that is a very heavy thing to put inside a child. My friend Rebecca grew up in a stricter district than mine, over in Ohio. We met years later after we had both left. She told me that in her community girls were explicitly taught a sequence. She called it the chain. God, then the church, then the husband, then the children. A woman existed within that chain. Her role was to keep it intact. Rebecca said that by the time she was 9, she had already learned not to disagree with her older brother in front of others, even when he was wrong. Not because anyone had sat her down and told her, but because she had seen, enough times, the face her mother made when Rebecca spoke out of turn. That face, quiet, tightened, worried, communicated everything. You are making this harder for all of us. Be small, be easy. Disappear into the chain. She told me she spent the first 30 years of her life genuinely believing that having an opinion of her own was a form of sin. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. 30 years of believing in her bones that her own thoughts were spiritually dangerous. And here is the part I need you to understand, because this is where it gets complicated. It did not feel like oppression from the inside. That is the most disorienting thing to try to explain to someone who grew up outside of it. When you are trained in something from birth, when every person around you lives inside the same framework, when the framework is held together by love and community and belonging and faith, it does not feel like a cage. It feels like the world. It feels like truth. I loved my community. I loved the frolics. The way 50 people would show up to raise a barn. The way nobody was ever alone in grief. I loved the singing. I loved the way my grandmother's kitchen smelled in November. None of that was false. None of that was a trick. But here is what I know now, after years of therapy and distance and reading and rebuilding. You can love a place that has harmed you. You can be grateful for what it gave you and still be honest about what it took. Those two things are not opposites. They can live inside the same person at the same time. What it took from me was the belief that my own perception of my own experience was reliable. By the time I was 10 years old, I had already learned to distrust my own discomfort. When something felt wrong, my first response was not "this is wrong," it was "what is wrong with me for feeling this?" That internal reversal, that automatic self-blame, is one of the most effective mechanisms of control I have ever encountered. And it was installed in me before I was old enough to read. If you want to go deeper into how this system works, and how women eventually find their way out of it, The full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. It covers things I can't get to in a single video. There was a teacher in our one-room schoolhouse. Her name was Sister Erna, and she was the first adult woman I ever saw who held still when she spoke. Not frozen, not submissive, just still. Like someone who had decided she was allowed to take up space. She was Amish. She was plain. She wore her prayer cap and her long dress. She was not radical in any visible way, but when she taught, she would pause and look at you, really look, and ask, what do you think? Not what does the answer say. What do you think? I remember the first time she asked me that. I was 7. I looked around the room, certain I had misunderstood. What did I think? The question seemed almost nonsensical, like being asked what color the sky tasted. I had opinions. Of course I had opinions, but the idea that an adult was asking for them, was waiting for them, was leaning forward slightly to hear them, that was new. That was a gap in the architecture. I think about Sister Erna a lot. I don't know where she is now. I don't know if she ever left or if she found a way to breathe inside the structure. But I know that what she did, that small, quiet thing, asking a 7-year-old girl what she thought, planted something in me that the system spent the next 15 years trying to root out. It didn't succeed. When I was 9, I started watching my mother differently. Not with the eyes of a child who accepts everything, but with something sharper beginning to form behind my eyes. Something that didn't have a name yet, but would later be called critical thinking. I noticed that my mother never finished a sentence when my father was in the room. Not because he interrupted her, not because he was cruel. My father was not a cruel man. But because she had internalized over decades that the appropriate length of a woman's thought was whatever fit in the space a man was willing to give it. I noticed that when she disagreed with something, and she did disagree, I could see it in the brief tightening around her eyes, she would wait. She would wait until they were alone, and then she would say it sideways. Never as a disagreement, as a question. Don't you think maybe it might be worth considering? And then the thing she actually thought, soft-wrapped in enough uncertainty that it didn't count as challenge. She had learned to deliver her own mind as if it were asking permission to exist. I was 9. I watched this. And something in me that was still unbroken said, I do not want to do that. I do not want to spend my life asking permission to think. That was the beginning of leaving, though I didn't know it yet. I was 9 years old, and already I could feel the shape of the cage, even if I still believed, on the surface, that it was the shape of the world. My therapist, I found her years after I left, said something I have turned over in my mind every day since. She said, the deepest form of control is not when someone tells you what to do. It's when they teach you to tell yourself. By 10 years old, most Amish girls have already learned to police themselves. They have learned to silence the voice that says, this is not fair. They have learned to interpret their own discomfort as spiritual weakness. They have learned that the highest praise they can receive is that she is such a good, quiet girl, and they have learned to want that praise, because inside a closed community, that praise is how you survive. It is belonging. And belonging, when it is the only world you have, is everything. That is not weakness. I want to say that clearly. The girls who learned those lessons, who mastered that disappearing act, they were not weak. They were surviving. They were doing exactly what any intelligent person does inside a system that offers love and belonging on one side and shunning and exile on the other. They were making the only rational choice available to them. The cruelty was not in the girls. The cruelty was in the choice they were given. If you grew up somewhere that taught you that your needs were selfish, that your voice was too loud, that your job was to make yourself easy, I see you. If you spent years believing that your own discomfort was a spiritual problem, a character flaw, evidence of too much pride, you are not alone. What was installed in you before you were old enough to consent to it was not truth. It was a system. And systems can be examined. Systems can be understood. And once you can see the shape of the cage clearly, once you can name every bar, or every mechanism, every moment where a small girl was taught to make herself smaller, you are already partway out. I wasn't too young to fold laundry and wash dishes and yield and disappear. I was too young to know that I had any other option. If this story opened something in you, leave me a comment. Tell me what part stayed with you. Tell me if any of this sounds like your world, even if your world had nothing to do with Lancaster County. Because the tools they used on us, silence, belonging, theological smallness, the reversal of discomfort into self-blame, those tools are not uniquely Amish. They are very, very old. And a lot of people are still living inside them. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. And if you want to keep hearing from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to the channel. I have so many more truths waiting. Until next time, your thoughts are not sin. They never were. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.